Tēnā tātou katoa. Good morning, my name's Richard Jenson. For those of you who don't know me, I've been part of this community for about 8 years or so now, and when it's the deep, dark part of winter and they think no one's going to turn up, Joseph lets me loose again. And as a number of the speakers who've rolled out over the past few weeks have talked about Joseph kind of allocating us our topic, Joseph gave me a passage on Romans. And I don't know about you, I think I'm probably the only one, but when the book of Romans comes to mind, I can't help but think of the movie Anchorman. Anchorman, you might ask? Well, nearly 20 years since its release, so I'm treating this as a historical movie now. For many males, particularly of a certain age, it remains one of the most quotable movies, perhaps of all time. And when I think of the book of Romans, I think of a quote, recurring theme in the movie, when in Rome. Now, some context for you. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, it centres on Ron Burgundy, the man at the centre of the slide. He's a relatively ignorant buffoon, but he gets by on his charm and looks and the fact that he's a male in the misogynistic world of 1970s TV news. Despite all that, he has quite an inflated sense of his own intelligence. He's contrasted in the movie with Veronica Corningstone, the blonde woman just off his shoulder there. She's highly competent, a female newsreader, highly intelligent, but she's unable to advance her career, make it forward because of this misogynistic, male-focused world of 1970s TV news. And their competing levels of intelligence are perhaps best summed up in Ron's total lack of knowledge and total inability to grasp this well-known cliche of when in Rome. And I've got a couple of clips from the movie that sum that up. So Ron just doesn't get it. Now, of course, the quote, the cliche, as we know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And in some senses, it's quite a nice concept. It speaks to being curious about other people. It speaks to being accommodated by others and being willing to walk in other people's skin, particularly when you're on their turf. Now, when it comes to the book of Romans and the things that Paul talks about in there, I don't know about you, but I think I can sometimes be a bit more of a Ron Burgundy than a Veronica Corningstone. I think I know what it's all about. I think I've got the ideas in my head, but sometimes when I try to explain them or put them into practice, things fall flat. And I think that's particularly the case when it comes to the latter part of the book of Romans, where Paul starts to talk to the Roman community and talk about how they're to live together. And when I look at these passages, and we're going to unpack one of them today, I find sometimes they're a little bit hard to understand, let alone implement. And I think part of that is probably due to our context versus the Roman context. As we'll discuss, part of this Roman community was this Jewish community, which is an Eastern communal culture, and living together with one another in close community was really part of how they existed. It was in their DNA. For us, I guess the water we swim in, the air we breathe, in many ways pushes against living in close community with others. We live in a very individualistic culture. It's a culture where making it on your own is seen as a virtue, and needing help from others or relying on others can be seen as a weakness. And so that sometimes feels like we're pushing against ourselves when we're trying to get into community. Added to that is, I guess, this historical moment we're living in, where societies, communities, there's marked by division. And seems that people seem to be focusing on what divides people, how we're different from people, rather than maybe what brings us together. So perhaps more than ever, it's worth asking, well, what does it mean to do as the Romans do? So this morning we're going to do that. We're going to look at part of Romans chapter 12. It's a passage where Paul's talking to this Roman church about what it means to live in community. We're going to look at what it means to sit Shiva. We're going to look at the wrath of God, whether that can be a good thing. And all the while we're going to ask ourselves, well, how is it that we can live together in harmony? So the book of Romans, what is it all about? Well, it can be a bit of a challenging one, and I think before we launch into this, we probably need to think about some of the baggage we all bring to looking at the book of Romans. I mean, for some of us, it's a collection of verses, almost tweetable verses, that leads inexorably to a prayer that we pray so that we can become a Christian and go to heaven. And that's the sort of Romans road that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. But I think it's probably a bit more than that. On the other hand, I think sometimes we can get intimidated by the book of Romans. We can think it's theologically dense, there's a lot to it, there's a lot that we need to know before we can even start to read it. We really don't know where to start. I think as I've looked at the book of Romans and as I've kind of tried to make my way and muddling my way to prepare this sermon, I think what's really helped me understand the book is by looking at the context in which the letter was written, who it was written to, and why it was written. So if we think about the early church and this early church in Rome, the church in Rome was a diverse and, in a sense, divided sort of church. Now, of course, the context is in the early days of what we might understand the church to be now. It was, in fact, in many people's eyes, simply a Jewish sect with a number of Jewish believers who were following the way, believed Jesus to be the Messiah, but still saw themselves as essentially Jewish people. Added to that, though, through the work of Paul, we have all these Gentile believers, people with no Jewish roots, no alignment to the Jewish faith, but nevertheless following Jesus and becoming part of this movement. And of course, Rome, the center of the empire, this cultural melting pot, where we have both of these two groups coming and living together. So a bit of history. Under the Emperor Claudius, and because of some issues amongst the Jewish people, some ructions from the Jewish people, including the Jewish Christians in Rome, all of the Jews were expelled from Rome, meaning for a period of years, this fledgling Christian community in Rome was just a Gentile church without any Jewish members, no people tying it back to its Jewish roots. If we fast forward to after Claudius dies, all of the Jews are welcomed back. The Jewish Christians return, and this church must now deal with both the Gentile believers and the Jewish Christians living together. Two groups of people with different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding their faith, trying to live together as a community. And it's to this church that's trying to reconstitute itself after the Jewish Christians have returned, that the book of Romans is written. And biblical scholar Daniel Kirk explains the situation quite neatly. So imagine this. Christian Gentiles have been worshipping Israel's God and celebrating Jesus as Messiah for years without any Jews present at all. It becomes easy to forget the Jewish roots of the faith. Then the Jews return, including Christian Jews, and the people have to figure out how to live together in their faith communities, or even if they should. Why could this be problematic? Well, imagine there's a church potluck. A few dozen people won't show up if you bring your favourite green bean casserole with bacon. Do these people get to control the food? that's just one example. For now, just imagine a situation in which the Gentiles need to adjust to the Jews returning to town. What are the Gentiles to make of the Jews? Are the Gentiles replacing the Jews? Are they the newly favoured children? How should Gentiles and Jews in the same worshipping community reconcile their different ways of life? Does it matter that some people keep kosher and others don't? Should everyone honour the great feast days of the Jewish read biblical calendar? If Jews and Gentiles are both part of the people of God, then what delineates the identity of this newly formed people? If Gentile Christians don't need to keep the law, then what actions count as faithfulness and obedience to God? This is the question. How do you know what faithfulness to God looks like if the newcomers aren't required to follow scriptural commandments? So we can see, can't we, the challenges that are being faced. And I guess it's pretty easy to draw parallels to any number of communities, any number of situations where there's different groups with competing backgrounds, ideals, ways of understanding things. And it's with these challenges in mind that Paul writes to the Romans, and one of the issues he grapples with is, well, how are you all going to live together as a diverse community? Now, of course, the first part of the book of Romans covers, I guess, the what this all sits under. And it all really comes under the banner of God's faithfulness and love to all of the members of the community, both the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. They're all brought together by God's love, exemplified by Jesus' faithfulness on the cross. And I guess whenever we talk about our community and how we are to live together, I guess that's always got to be our starting point. We all live under the umbrella of God's love and faithfulness, and it's under that umbrella that our community and our lives together are to function. So Paul goes on from that point to write about how this Roman church is to live together in community. And this morning I just want to focus on a part of Romans 12, just 8 verses from Romans 12, verses 14 to 21. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it's mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, I could probably sit down at this point. These are the sorts of passages that I think it's always helpful to come back to in our life of faith, just to read through them, let them speak to us, let them understand, because I'm sure for each and every one of us there'd be different verses that would pop out at different little challenges and prods to us. I think if we look at this passage anyway as a whole, what Paul's really giving us as a model in how we live together is to look at Jesus and his sacrifice as a model for how we're to live together in community. Bless those who persecute you. Do not repay evil for evil. Never avenge. Those were the hallmarks of Jesus' life, and particularly Jesus' faithfulness at the crucifixion. And it's a model of harmonious living together. It's a life of mutual sacrifice to one another. Now, I just want to acknowledge that someone sitting at the front of church telling you to be more sacrificial can probably be something that's a little bit problematic, if not triggering for some people. I'm sure there's some people at least who probably spent a good many years being sacrificial for the church, exhausting ourselves, serving at multiple church services, meeting every night of the week, and of course, financial sacrificial giving and all the drains that come with that. In the worst of cases, I think sometimes this idea of being sacrificial can be almost weaponized. It's used against people to try and get them to do things that they actually just don't want to do. So that's not what I want to do. So don't take what I have today as another call from a person up the front at church telling you if you don't doing more things, you're doing things wrong. Because I think actually at its core, if we look at sacrifice in that way, we're falling back into our individualistic way of looking at things. Whereas if we're living in community, we're actually living in a life where we're being mutually sacrificial to one another. There's a give and a take. There's a living in harmony. For me anyway, I think this is the difference between living and effectively working in an institution and existing and living within a community. If you find yourself somewhere in a hierarchy where it's all about sacrificing more for the sake of the church, for the sake of the company, for the sake of the club, for the sake of the PTA, I don't think you're living in a community. You're living in an institution, and the sacrifice isn't a mutual sacrifice. You're the one that's being sacrificed. And I think it's been touched on already, but actually these ideas about community and how we live together are things that we will take into all areas of our life, all the different groups and contexts in which we have a part to play in our broader life. We are to gather well and to scatter well. And I think the principles that inform our gathering well are also what we take when we scatter well. Because if we're living together in harmony, if we're engaging in mutual self-sacrifice with people, then we're not living in an institution, we're living in a community. So how do we do that? How do we live in a mutually sacrificial way in the context of community? How can we live in a way that creates the sort of flourishing and harmonious communities that I think everyone wants to be a part of? Well, that's a big question. It's probably a question that carries a little more weight than one sermon can lift. So what I want to do this morning is there's just a couple of really parts of this passage that I think if we delve into, if we unpack a little bit, they'll help us inch a little bit closer to being the sort of flourishing and harmonious communities that Paul wants the Romans to be. And I think, for me at least, the two parts that we'll look at are parts that we probably gloss over a little bit when we read this. I think the first one we probably gloss over because we think we know what it means. And the second one we probably gloss over because it is a little bit confusing and leaves us a bit puzzled. So this morning I'm just going to focus on this idea of mourning with those who mourn and what this idea of the wrath of God is doing in there, and whether the wrath of God can actually be a good thing that helps our communities. So firstly, mourning with those who mourn. Now the passage is pretty clear. We rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. So what does this mean, and why is it significant? Now I think in our 21st century society, and certainly as 21st century Christians, I think we can often read this idea as just being about empathy. And empathy is, of course, important. It's important to be empathetic, but I think empathy is developing a particularly high value in society at the moment. It's very important to always respond appropriately, but I think sometimes we can think this is just about empathy. It's about sending flowers, it's about sending a text, responding to the Facebook post with an appropriate comment. So I think sometimes we can fall into the trap that thinking, with rejoicing with those who rejoice and mourning with those who mourn, it's just about getting our emojis right. But is that what Paul's really getting at? Is that what it really means? I think the answer to that is if we dig a little deeper and look, well, actually, what did it mean for this Jewish community, these two different parts of this Roman community, to mourn? And we'll start with the Jewish community, the Jewish Christians. Because mourning with those who mourn was kind of what they did. The Jewish practice at the time was a practice known as sitting Shiva. It's a practice that had ancient roots. It was, of course, active in the first century, and it's evolved and continues to this day as an important part of Jewish culture. It's a practice that begins after the funeral, continues for 7 days, and that's where the Shiva comes from, because Shiva is the Hebrew word for 7. And during this 7-day period, the immediate family of the deceased, they simply remain at home. And the members of their community come and visit them. They come and sit with them. They share condolences. They join in prayer services. Now, importantly, it's not a sort of hospitality open house thing where those who are grieving are constantly making cups of tea and making sure everyone's got a biscuit. Those who are sitting Shiva, those who are mourning, they're not to engage in any hospitality. They're not even meant to go and greet people at the door, lest they become distracted from their grieving and working through that grief process in this immediate aftermath of the funeral. So what's then the role of the visitor? What's the role of the member of the community coming to visit during this mourning period? The role of Shiva visitors is not to cheer up mourners. The purpose of the condolence call is not to convince the mourner of anything at all. Rather, visitors should simply be fully present with mourners however they are. To that end, Jewish law instructs visitors to wait for mourners to speak before addressing them. The law seems to anticipate our tendency to say unhelpful things to grieving people. She's in a better place now, or you need to be strong for the kids. And it instructs us to just keep quiet until we're spoken to. Jewish law even advises visitors not to use the typical "how are you" kind of greeting to address mourners, preferring something more like "I'm so sorry" and or a heartfelt hug. What a beautiful picture of a community truly being there for people in their deepest need, and by being there for people, being actually present with people just how they are. Now we can contrast sitting Shiva with the Gentile Roman mourning approach to mourning, the sort of pagan approach, I guess. Now, for the pagan Romans, for the Gentile Romans, they too had this period of time where the deceased family would return home. And that period lasted for 9 days. But in those 9 days, nobody was to come to visit. They were left in their house alone because, in terms of their cultural understanding, they were unclean because they were associated with someone who had recently died. So it's a stark contrast, isn't it? This approach to mourning between the Jewish Christians' approach and what would have been the Gentile Romans' background as to how they would understand what it meant to mourn and to be a community to people who are mourning. Sometimes I think we can get a bit of a caricature of the New Testament that it's somehow basically just a critique of Judaism. Just so, well, we just need to get rid of all that. That was the old way of doing things. And we can sometimes think that's what Paul's all about. And while Paul's quite clear that, strict adherence to the law isn't necessary, I don't think it's the case that he's just sitting there telling the Jews just to lighten up a bit and they need to stop being so hung up on their traditions. And I think that's borne out when we think about what Paul is asking this community to do: mourn with those who mourn. It's like he's saying, look, I know you're all coming from different backgrounds. I know you've got different traditions, but look at your traditions and don't lose sight of the beauty that they can offer, particularly if your tradition is causing you to be a community that is truly with one another, present with each other, however they're doing. And I think this is part of what he's saying about, well, this is how you're going to be a community that flourishes and lives in harmony. You've got to be there for each other. You've got to be present for one another. Now that's, I guess for us, particularly in our modern world, that's always going to be a sacrificial way of being. Sitting and being with people, however they are, does take time and energy and resource. But in a sense, I think it's the only way that we can truly share life together and truly find ourselves living in community. Now, please, I don't want you to take it as me sitting here saying this is something that St. Luke is awful at and we need to do much better. My family's been blessed this year with the birth of a new child, and as part of that, we've also been blessed by members of this community and our wider community providing meals for us. And one thing that was really amazing through that process is that when people in dropping off the meal would spend some time with us and sometimes even share the meal with us. And I think that really hit home for me, the sense in which we were then able to share the joy that we were experiencing in our lives with others, to share the joy and the love and to feel that joy and love amongst the whole community. And maybe that's why this jumped out to me when I looked at this passage, because I think it shows how actually being present with one another in these sorts of times helps us to grow together more deeply as a community. So rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. Now, making room for wrath. Now, this is the second part I want to focus on from this passage, and it's something that I think we maybe gloss over because it doesn't seem to quite fit. We've got Paul talking, of course, to the Romans about living under an umbrella of love and God's faithfulness to one another. He wants them to live peaceably. He doesn't want them to be avenging each other. But by the way, if you feel like you need some avenging, just leave room for the wrath of God, and he'll sort that out for you. Doesn't seem to fit, does it? Sort of the same sentiment, but rather than acting on our desire to avenge, we'll just squash it down and hope that God smacks them over later on. Now, I think the fact that it stands out like this comment about the wrath of God and the comment about God doing the avenging, I think it actually points to the fact that Paul's actually being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. Because, of course, one of the whole points of Paul's letter to the Romans is to sort of speak particularly to the Jewish Christians and say, look, if you thought that the way that God was going to fix what is wrong with the world was by punishing people, if you thought God was going to remove sin from the world by punishing everyone who's misbehaved, that's not how God is. That's never been how God is. In fact, God has now shown us what he is like through the faithfulness of Jesus. And so rather than using external punishments as a way of making the world a better place, God, through Jesus and through his faithfulness, is now bringing about change in the world through internal work with us. So rather than removing sinful people through punishment, he's working in us over time, removing the sinful ways, the ways that we fall short of us over time as we grow and develop. So the wrath of God is now actually the internal work that God is doing on all of us to help us grow and develop. So I think that's almost a sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of reference to be like, well, no, don't avenge people. Leave room for God's wrath and the fact that God might actually be making some changes internally that will resolve these issues you're facing. So it's like Paul saying, well, don't avenge yourself. Just do good to other people. Leave room for God to make the changes, for God to make things right amongst you. Don't try to sort these differences out for yourself by bringing consequences on people, but offer grace and trust that God is working in all of us to change us and to make us more Christ-like. So we need to let wrath do its work, and I think we need to acknowledge that sometimes the wrath needs to work on us. Now, I just want to pause here because I think there's some things this passage is talking about and there's some things that there aren't. And I think if it's a situation where there's abuse, where there's damage, where there's dishonesty, it's not as if Paul's saying, oh, don't worry about that, we'll just let that go through the keeper and hope that it comes out better in the end. I don't think that's what Paul's talking about at all. And he's not talking about suppressing stuff that clearly needs to be dealt with and brought to life and confronted because it is wrong. What he's talking about is this context of these two groups of believers where people are honestly trying to work out their differences, where people are honestly coming at things from different angles. We've got different backgrounds, contexts, ways of understanding how to do the community, how they understand God. It's in that context he's talking about leaving room for God to do the work. He's not talking about just letting people who are doing bad things just to continue on their merry way, wreaking havoc in a community. So if we come back to this idea of how the wrath of God can work, I think we've all had situations in our lives where we've changed our mind about things. We might have had staunch opinions on a topic. What is the truth? But over time, as life has happened to us, we've changed and refined our position. I think if I look back on my own views of life as a teenager, my views of life and issues in my early 20s when I thought I knew everything and the truth about everything, my views of life and how to do life before I had children, my views of life and how to do life before I had a pandemic. It's humbling when you look back on life and how you thought about things, how you dealt with people, how you understood people, to consider how much change and growth can happen over time. And I think in many ways this might be what Paul is getting at by letting the wrath of God do its work, letting God's changing power work in people over time to change us, to grow us, to make him more like Jesus. Makes you think sometimes the differences we have between people, the difference in views, the things that really butt up against. Perhaps the only difference is really a bit more time for God to work in one or both of us. So just as we're to create space to mourn with those who mourn, to be present with people, we also need to create space for other people's views, ideas, their backgrounds, their ways of understanding the world. Understanding that God's actually working in all of us. In fact, despite our own views of what the situation might be, what the truth of the situation might be, time might tell us that we are wrong. And it's us that God might needs to be doing the work in. So for this Roman audience, it might have gone like this. You may be a Jewish Christian, thinking you're the chosen people, that you know the rules, you know how things are done. Well, Paul says, leave room for the wrath of God. You may yet learn from those Gentile Christians ways of greater freedom and openness. Or to the Gentile Christians, Paul might be saying, well, you might think you're the true believers because you're not constrained by the law. You've had this somehow more pure experience of Jesus. Leave room for the wrath of God. For you may yet learn the gifts and freedoms that come from tradition. So in some ways, I think we can sort of redefine the wrath of God from something to be afraid of to maybe something we want to invite in our lives and in the lives of our communities. Now, in the world we're living in at the moment, this idea of leaving room for the wrath of God is, of course, sacrificial, and it's very, I think, countercultural. I mean, we only need to look at the world of social media and television that people don't come to engage in issues and come to engage in discussions in public spaces based on the sense that, well, this is what I think, but, I could actually be wrong about this and I'd really like to hear other people's views. When was the last time we heard that? In fact, it's usually the case of, well, this is my truth, this is what I think, and if you think otherwise, you need to just stop being so mean and go away. And look, I think sometimes people of faith can actually be the worst at this. People of faith can be the ones who sit there saying, well, we know the truth, we've got a mortgage on the truth, we don't care what you have to say. Something to reflect on. Because just as making space to be with others is sacrificial, leaving room for God's wrath, leaving room for the fact that you might be wrong, that's sacrificial. Because you're sacrificing the sense that, well, I'm right. I know the truth. I know how things are. That's what we're sacrificing. But what do we gain? Well, we gain curiosity. We gain an openness. We gain opportunities to actually engage and understand people. We gain an opportunity for ourselves to grow and to broaden our understanding of the richness of who God is. So that's what I think Paul might be getting at. And I think it's a message for us. If we want to live in diverse and flourishing communities, if we want to live in harmony with other people, we need leave room for the wrath of God to be working in us. We need to leave room for the fact that we may be wrong and instead approach other people with different practices, different views, different ways of seeing the world with humility and curiosity. And then we'll allow God to work on us in a good way so that we can be growing into something new and more beautiful. An organizational psychologist, Adam Grant, puts it like this. I think the clearest sign of intellectual chemistry isn't agreeing with someone, it's enjoying your disagreements with them. Harmony isn't the combination of identical sounds. It's the pleasing arrangement of different tones, different voices, or different instruments. Creative tension can make beautiful music. So what does it mean to do as the Romans do? Well, don't sacrifice yourself just for sacrifice's sake, but instead focus your urge to live sacrificially on making room to be with people and making room for people and for different types of people. Because if we're doing that, we're creating the opportunity for ourselves to be part of a community where we can be truly ourselves and where we allow others to do the same. So to wrap up this morning, we're going to take communion together. And I think it's always appropriate to take communion, but as we reflect on community, as we reflect on the things that unite us rather than divide us, I think the communion table is a beautiful picture of that. In a sense, it's a great leveler. Everyone who follows Jesus is welcome at the table, and we all come in the same spirit, despite our different stories, backgrounds, views, and the like. So what we'll do is I'll close with a benediction, and then I'll invite you to come and take communion, and then we'll just leave it there for you to take communion in your own space, and then you can move out to go and collect your children, or move into morning tea and enjoy the rest of your day. So, a benediction. So may you sit Shiva with those who are mourning and dance with those who are dancing. May you know that you could be wrong, and may the wrath of God work wonders in you. And may we all live in harmony, not as the same note being played by everyone as loud as they can, but as a pleasing arrangement of tones, voices, and instruments, playing the music of who God wants us to be. Creative tensions can make beautiful music, so perhaps it's time to join the band. So that ends my side of it. I'll invite you to come and take communion together, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Grace and peace.